specifically after 9/11. I thank you, Dad, for introducing this to me as a kid. And the best comparison that is made in that episode is very apt. And this will be our end that then provides the link to next week. That Al-Qaeda or ISIS is to Islam as the KKK is to Christianity. The KKK killed, pillaged, murdered, burned in the name of Christianity. The white robes signify the salvation of Jesus. The hood signifies that in Jesus we are all one. The burning cross speaks for itself. You had to be a Protestant Christian and go to church every Sunday to be a part and a member of the KKK. They did everything they did in the name of Christianity. That's what Al-Qaeda and ISIS do. A few things to begin this second session. First of all, thank you all for coming back. For those of you who are here for the second time, welcome to the new people. I appreciate you being here. A quick introduction to myself again. My name is Matt Davies. I'm a professor of religion and philosophy at Shemeketa Community College. I've studied at Linfield and Yale University. Both my degrees are in some form of religion. And I've spent my short amount of time on this planet studying other religions, coming from a Christian perspective. So in case it wasn't clear from week one, for this week, I'm not trying to convert you to Islam. That's not the purpose of this at all, because I haven't myself converted to Islam. We are trying to understand people as they understand themselves. And that's a very, very important thing for us to understand before we even get started. I want to do a very quick recap. Hopefully this is 90 seconds of what we did last week, and especially the stuff that's going to carry over into today. So first slide, please, Dave. The quick review. Remember that the majority of Muslims across the world live in the Asia-Pacific region. More than 60%, probably now up into 65%. I have more than 62% up there because that's our 2010 numbers. About 65% live in the Asia-Pacific region. Remember our top 5 countries: Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nigeria. That's where the majority of Muslims live. Indonesia has more Muslims across the world than Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Afghanistan combined. So when we're talking then about Islam as a whole, we need to look at Asia-Pacific region, not the Middle East. Islam means peace and surrender, the peace that we receive when we surrender from God. That's because the main problem in the world for Islam is self-sufficiency and idolatry. We think we can get by without God, but in fact, we have to rely on God to live, and nothing can replace God. So we submit to God, and God gives us peace. Remember that Allah is not the Muslim name for God. It is the Arabic word for God. It is simply another language. So Christians and Jews and atheists and any other religion that speaks Arabic calls God Allah. It's the Arabic word for God, not the Muslim name for God. The Quran is a revelation given to Muhammad from God through the angel Gabriel that confirms the New Testament and the Old Testament that comes before it. That God gave the Jews the Old Testament, God gave the Christians the New Testament, and God gave Muslims the Quran. The Quran confirms what came before it, and Jews and Christians are referred to as people of the book because of this common revelation that God gave all of us. And we want to remember that there are multiple ways to interpret the Quran. You cannot just read the Quran and pull one verse out of it and say that goes. So all the interpretations of that I'm going to be talking about today, there's a bedrock of a good 1,000 years of interpretation of what I'm about to tell you today. I'm not just pulling verses out. I've spent a good 10 to 15 hours reading commentaries this week to make sure that I get a good overview of 1,000 years of Quranic interpretation. So we look at the Quran itself, we look at the Hadith, the teachings of the Prophet, and we look at the Sunnah. I didn't bring this up last week, but we look at the Sunnah, the example of the Prophet, how we actually lived. We look at the consensus of scholars, all the academics and theologians and jurists coming together and interpreting the Quran as a group, bringing together a consensus so that one sole person doesn't derail the entire interpretation. We look at historical context. That's what we're going to be focusing on the most today, because the Quran was revealed in a very particular time period, just as the Old Testament was, just as the New Testament was. And so we have to look at what that context is in order for it to make sense. And we always remember that the few must be interpreted in light of the many. If we have a few verses that seem to differ from the majority of the Quran, we are going to rely on the majority of the Quran. And most religions tend to do this with whatever sacred texts that they have. The other thing we need to say before we get started: Islam is not pacifistic. It just needs to be said. Islam is not pacifistic. I will not be making an argument that Islam does not talk about violence or war. It very clearly does, and I think we all know that because we have all seen verses being used from the Quran to incite violence. Islam is not pacifistic. It allows for military force in limited contexts, and we're going to be talking about that today. I'm also not going to be engaging in what we call proof texting. I'm not going to put up bad verses and then put up good verses and say one outweighs the other. There will be some of that today. I will show you good verses and I will show you bad verses. The important part that I want to do today is I want to make sure that we interpret the bad verses correctly, as the majority of Muslims do. Remember, there are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. How do they interpret the Quran? Not the 100,000 ISIS members, the 80,000 Al-Qaeda members. I don't care about them, though obviously that will come up today also. Okay, so we will be looking at these verses in their historical context on how the majority of Muslims interpret them. So let's talk about the historical context. We have to remember that Muhammad lived in 7th century Arabia. That's a much different time period than we have now. And we have to remember that not all Muslims interpret the Quran literally. They recognize this historical context. Muhammad was in Mecca. That's where he was born, and that's where he started his ministry. When he received the revelations from God, he hung out in Mecca for a while to teach and to preach. He was not widely accepted at all. He was persecuted quite heavily. People beat him. People threw him in jail. Muhammad owned a caravan company, and so people refused to do business with him. He was very heavily persecuted inside Mecca. But we have verses that are revealed to Muhammad from this Mecca time period that says, do not retaliate. You have to accept this persecution. You cannot fight back. These are what the early verses revealed from the Quran. So we have in Mecca, let me set the stage again, because we need to talk about what Mecca was. I brought this up last week, but here's the review also. Mecca was full of idols and polytheism. The Kaaba, towards which all Muslims pray, there were 360 idols that circled it. This included idols to Mary and Jesus. So gods from all across the world, they had their idols at the Kaaba. And Muhammad, when he received his revelation from God, he told everyone to destroy the idols because he wanted monotheism. There's one monotheistic God that's shared by Christianity and Judaism. We need to destroy all the idols and rededicate the Kaaba, built by Abraham and Ishmael, to the one monotheistic God. Meccans didn't like this, because not only was Mecca was this hub of trade, it was at the center of caravan routes, which meant that it was a very rich place, and we had businessmen coming from all across the world who needed a place to worship while they're on their business trips. So now we have tourism, economy, and religion all tied into one, and Muhammad challenged all of them. Destroy the idols, which is going to destroy the tourism, which will collapse Mecca being a center of trade routes. So people didn't like Muhammad for a very good reason. It's all about money. So that's why they beat him. That's why they persecuted him. Muhammad was recognized, though, in the larger areas as a great man, as a politician, as a mediator, as a prophet. And so in 622, we have people from Medina. Medina is about 200 miles north of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. People from Medina came down to Muhammad and said, we have this internal political dispute in our city. Can you come and take care of this for us? In exchange for you mediating our political dispute, we will protect you from the Meccans who are trying to kill you, and we will worship the one monotheistic God. Muhammad said, fine. And so he fled in the middle of the night from Mecca to Medina, settled the dispute, and became the governor of Medina. Muhammad was a politician. And so in that sense, everything that we talk about and what the Quran says, we need to think about it in terms of Moses, not Jesus. Jesus wasn't a politician. Jesus was not about setting up a form of government. Moses was. Moses he revealed the Torah to us as a way to set up a Jewish society. The Quran was revealed to set up a Muslim society. So we need to think about Muhammad in those terms. So he was in Medina, which had religious diversity. There were Jewish tribes there. And he settled the dispute. He allowed for freedom of religion. If you worship the one monotheistic God, he allowed for freedom of religion inside Medina, which meant that Jews were able to worship freely. He did not try to convert anyone to Islam because he recognized that Jews worshiped the same God. And he became a great politician inside Medina. The Meccans, though, from the polytheistic Mecca, they thought that Muhammad was amassing an army in Medina to come attack them, to come out back and to wipe out the Kaaba and destroy all the idols. So Mecca declared war on Medina. Mecca declared war on Muhammad. That automatically now puts a lot of the Quranic revelations into a period of warfare, where Muhammad was a governor. He was in charge of other people. He was in charge of citizens. He was in charge of his family and other people's family. He had a responsibility to protect his city and his family and his religion because people literally declared war on him. So then Muhammad lived in this period of warfare. He was only in Medina for about 2 years before war was declared. They're fighting back and forth for about 4 years before a treaty was settled. And we call this the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Muhammad and a bunch of Muslims decided to go on the Hajj. Remember that pilgrimage to Mecca. They decided to go on the Hajj to Mecca. And the Meccan army met them before they could get there and refused to let them pass. And so the Treaty of Hudaybiyah said that Muhammad and the Muslims would go back to Medina, they would turn around, and they would be able to go on the Hajj next year, safely, peacefully. The Meccans would allow them to do that. So Muhammad and his army turned around and went back. When they came back the next year, Meccans didn't allow them to. They broke the treaty. So any of the references that we're going to read in the Quran today about breaking of the treaty, a lot of times we think it's referring to this, that the people they had an oath with, a treaty with, broke it. And remember, we're in a political time period. So the Treaty of Hudaybiyah was broken by the Meccans, and so it was established in 628. Tried to go back in 629 for the Hajj. That didn't work. So in 630 then, Muhammad said, enough. And he amassed a big army and marched to Mecca. What you won't hear in the news reports is that when Muhammad took over Mecca this final time, there was not one instance of bloodshed. He had such a big army with him that the Meccans gave up. They surrendered. They didn't want to fight him. And according to tribal custom at the time, Muhammad could have killed all of them. That's the way tribal warfare worked. He could have wiped them all out as prisoners of war, and he didn't kill a single person. He destroyed all the idols. He reestablished the Kaaba for the one monotheistic God, but he did not kill anyone in that final takeover of Mecca. God commanded him not to. So this is the context that a lot of the Quran is speaking to. This quite literal warfare with Muhammad being a governor, or commander-in-chief, if you will, in charge of a lot of other people. The other historical context we need to keep in mind is that religious affiliation, your religious belonging, is not the way that we think of religion in the 21st century. The way that we think about religion in the 21st century comes from the Enlightenment. It's much more individual. It's something that if you want to change, you should be free to change. And it's all about you. That's the way we tend to think about religion today. In 7th century Arabia, religion was seen more as a nationality. We tend to see that our identity as Americans are a little bit more tied tightly. You can't just switch nationality on a whim, or at least it's a lot harder to. Whereas you can switch religion on a whim if you want to. Religion needs to be seen in a political context, kind of like nationality. So if you switched religion in 7th century Arabia, it was very similar to treason or sedition. So this is why I have some of this on the board here. This is what we are going to continually refer to. that the idolaters that we're talking about are the polytheistic Meccans that had 360 idols surrounding the Kaaba that God told Muhammad to destroy in order to rededicate the Kaaba to the one monotheistic God. When we're talking about idolaters, that's who we're talking about. This word in Arabic that's translated as unbelievers or idolaters, it is never once used to refer to Jews and Christians. Not once. Remember, Jews and Christians are referred to as people of the book. So idolaters is now in a very particular context of the polytheistic Meccans that declared war on Muhammad. If we're looking then at what religion means, we're thinking about it as political and tribal loyalty, not an individual affirmation of who you think God is. And we're thinking in terms of a group. Community is more important than individuality because Muhammad was in charge of a city and he was in charge of a religion and he was responsible for not just himself. This is the context that we are going to need to think about a lot of these verses in. So when Muhammad was on his pilgrimage, when Muhammad fled from Mecca to Medina, that's when God revealed the very first verse that addresses violence in the Quran. So Dave, can you hit the next slide for us, please? This is the very first verse that condones or at least allows for violence inside the Quran. And remember, the Quran is not organized in terms of when the surahs were revealed. It's organized in terms of length. So we're going to be jumping around the Quran, but that's just the way it's organized. The very first verse that is revealed. Truly God defends those who believe. Truly God loves not any ungrateful traitor. Permission is granted to those who are fought because they have been wronged. And truly God is able to help them. Those who are expelled from their homes without right, only for saying our Lord is God. Were it not for God's repelling people, some by means of others, monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques, wherein God's name is mentioned much, would have been destroyed. And God will surely help those who help him. Truly God is strong and mighty. Who, were we to establish them upon the earth, would perform prayers, give alms, and enjoin right and forbid wrong. And unto God is the end of all affairs. The very first verse that allows for violence in the Quran, first of all, does not mandate violence. Permission is granted. This is not a command for everyone. This is, you are allowed to if you are fought, if you have been wronged. Remember, Mecca declared war on Muhammad. So now the very first verse is being read in this historical context that I just gave you. You have been wronged. You have been kicked out of your homes just for saying that God is one. You've had to flee. And now you are allowed to fight because you have been fought first. We also want to keep in mind the second part of this. That were it not for God's repelling of people, God pushing people back, God being involved in this fight himself, monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques all would have been destroyed because they all preach God's name. Just as we talked about last week about the Quran affirming the Old Testament and the New Testament, recognizing that this is the same God, Surah 22 tells us that the name of God is mentioned in churches, synagogues, mosques, monasteries, and therefore needs to be protected. All of them do. And when they were in Mecca, before they fled to Medina, that's exactly what they did. They protected churches and monasteries and synagogues because God's name is mentioned much. This is the context that we're talking about. Because this is the first verse that permits violence in the Quran, most Muslims say that any sort of defensive action needs to be taken in this context. Any sort of defensive action that's allowed in Islam today needs to be done in light of this. Because you have been kicked out of your homes, because you have been wronged first, or because you have been kicked out of monasteries, churches, synagogues, or mosques. This is the example that I brought up last week when the Arab Spring was happening in Egypt. Muslims surrounding Coptic Christian churches to allow them to pray and worship freely on Sunday morning, and Coptic Christians surrounding Muslims as they do their daily prayers in the midst of Egyptian tanks and soldiers surrounding them. That's following verse 22 or chapter 22. This is the context that we're talking about. The very first time religion or violence is allowed. If this is true then what do we hear about this jihad thing? What does this all mean? Can we hit the next slide, please, Dave? First of all, jihad does not mean holy war. It is not translated as holy war. It cannot be translated as holy war. That is not an accurate translation, no matter who you talk to. If they tell you that jihad means holy war, you are allowed to scream and yell at them. Jihad in Arabic means struggle or striving. The term for holy war is al-harb al-muqaddas. That term doesn't even exist in classical Arabic, which the Quran is written in. That phrase does not even exist anywhere in the Quran. Jihad means struggle, striving. And Muhammad himself set up two different types of jihad. And we know this because he had this saying, "You have returned from the lesser jihad to perform the greater jihad." So we have one form of jihad that's smaller, one form of jihad that's bigger. And obviously, the bigger one is more important. Remember that the problem in the world is self-sufficiency and idolatry. So the greater jihad is the struggle or the strive to remember God. It's the struggle or the strive to not think that we can get by on our own. The greater jihad is an internal spiritual struggle against sin. That's what jihad means, primarily. This takes on all sorts of different forms. Making sure we pray 5 times a day, that's jihad. Making sure that we speak up for truth, that's jihad. Making sure that we pay our charity, our zakat, that 2.5% of our total wealth, making sure we pay that is jihad. We can say that this is all struggling against self-sufficiency and idolatry. It's trying to remember who God is. That's the primary form of jihad. Treating someone with respect, not ripping them off, recognizing that we are all equal, trying to remember who God is in life. That is the greater jihad because that's the most important struggle or striving. That's how we attain heaven, eternal life. That is the greater jihad. If the greater jihad is the internal, then the lesser jihad is the external. This allows for violence, but that's not the only way that it takes form, nor is violence mandated in the lesser jihad. The lesser jihad is simply the external battle. And so Muhammad said that the greatest jihad, or the preferred jihad, is speaking truth in the presence of a tyrant, standing up for God, standing up for people around us, standing up for equality. That's all jihad. Muslims have this phrase, jihad of the pen. Are we writing good things? Are we combating ideas with other ideas? Jihad of the pen can be the external battle against enemies of Islam, against sin, against corruption, against oppression. But yes, lesser jihad also allows for limited warfare, limited violence. Again, because Muhammad was a governor. Muhammad was the leader of a country, a city, but you know what I'm saying. So if we are allowing for violence then in the lesser jihad, we have to allow for it in light of what we just read in the Quran. Surah 22, because you have been wronged yourself, because you have been kicked out of your homes, because Jews, Christians, Muslims are kicked out of their mosques and synagogues and churches. That's the limited arena that violence is allowed. It's a struggle or a strive against the enemies of God, against the enemies of monotheism, but more importantly, the greater jihad is a struggle against yourself. As Christians, which I assume most of us are, that should be a very common concept for us. Fighting against the flesh, in other words, to put it in Paul's language. We are called to fight against the flesh. That's jihad. That's all it is. Fighting against the sin that's in our life. We cannot use jihad in any sort of universal sense. Jihad is equivocal. But this is how jihad has to be translated, because that's what the Arabic means. If we're looking then, all we hear about is this lesser jihad. That's all we hear about in the news. So what are the limits on this? There are limits on how we can conduct violence. So the next slide will show us the limits on what this lesser jihad allows for in terms of warfare. Now we're zooming in. Okay, there's a lot more that can be said, but we're zooming in because this is, I think, what you all came here to hear. that keeping in mind Surah 22, this historical context of Muhammad and his followers being kicked out of Mecca, we understand that there are limits on what the lesser jihad and permitted violence, not commanded violence, permitted violence allows. It has to be done in terms of these three things, and we saw all of these in Surah 22. It's to maintain your own religion, and in this we include the entire ummah, the entire Muslim community, so you are allowed to engage in violence if your family is threatened, if your country is threatened. Violence can be undertaken to protect other religions. Most of the time we're talking about Jews and Christians, although in places like Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim country, this is also applied to Hindus. Hindus are protected class. Now, of course, we see violence in northern India with Muslims and Hindus fighting back and forth. We have Hindu monk terrorists. But Hindus tend to be classified as people of the book in India and Indonesia. So you can protect other religions who are preaching the one monotheistic God. Violence is allowed in that context. And thirdly, violence is allowed only if you have been offended yourself. And most of the time, this is an armed warfare. It's not just words hurting. This is armed warfare. And just as I talked about, the interpretation of the Quran has to be undertaken by a consensus of scholars. If we are engaging in the lesser jihad, it has to be undertaken by the consensus, the majority of the Muslim community, not just a rogue person saying, I have been wronged. The entire Muslim community has to come together and recognize this. These are some of the limits that we have on violence. Were you going to ask a question?
It just seems similar to just war theory.
This is exactly, so he said this sounds similar to just war theory. It's 100% just war theory. I'm not using that term because I don't know how much that term is going to resonate here, but it's 100% just war theory. Absolutely, yeah. The other limits that we see on violence in the Quran comes in how we can engage and who we are allowed to engage. So I said last week that the Quran forbids suicide. I put the reference up here for you, that in chapter 4, verses 29, we see, O you who believe, consume not each other's wealth falsely, but trade by mutual consent, and slay not yourselves. Truly God is merciful unto you. And whosoever does that in enmity, which is hostility, and injustice, we shall cause him to burn in a fire, and that is easy for God. So we see in this verse I just read 2 forms of jihad. We see an external battle, but we are commanded very clearly, and let me say that again, slay not yourselves. If you do, we will cause you, God and the angels will cause you to burn in a fire, which all of us Christians know is code for hell. You cannot kill yourselves. Not only that, but you can't rip people off. This is another form of jihad, making sure that we have honest business practices in our dealing. Do not kill yourselves. If we have a treaty among people, you cannot slay people with whom you have a treaty. This is something I learned this week while researching some of this stuff. It wasn't until 1928 that the international body came together to try to get rid of warfare as a legitimate form of foreign policy. Up until 1928, the international community said, if we have disputes, warfare, here we come. It was allowed. 1928 was the first time that the international community came together to try to prohibit warfare on an international scale. We now live in a time of the Geneva Convention, of the Charter of the United Nations, after a bunch of 2 massive world wars that we recognize decimated humanity. Up before 1924, people didn't think that way. So the limits on violence are revolutionary for 7th century Arabia. So if we have a treaty with people, all of this is to say, if we have a treaty with people, we cannot kill them. Most Muslims today say international law says that we have a treaty with everyone because warfare is illegal according to international law, which means you cannot kill anyone unless, again, war has been declared on you. Everything that we do, peace must be achieved. When we're talking about these verses that we're going to be considering in context, the part that you don't hear recited in the news is almost always after this violent verse is read, The next verse that comes after it says, but if they incline towards peace, you meet them there. If your enemy wants peace, then you are religiously obligated to achieve peace. You may win your war, but you have to meet them in peace. We also have limits on you can't kill women, children, elderly. You can't kill, most Muslims today say you can't kill POWs. Some of the Quranic interpretation is contested on that one. You can't willfully destroy property. And any violence that is allowed has to be reciprocal. We'll show you a verse that talks about that also. Any violence that is allowed has to be reciprocal. So yes, Islam talks about violence. Yes, Islam permits violence in limited contexts. Again, Islam is not a pacifistic religion. But if any of you have legitimately read the Old Testament, this should not come as a surprise. There are in Deuteronomy 22, in the span of 4 verses, I am given 3 commands to kill women, to stone women if they have committed a sexual sin. And all 3 of those commands are accompanied by, so shall you purge the evil from your midst. That phrase is found 9 times in the Bible, and every time that phrase is found, I'm allowed to stone someone or kill someone. As one of my seminary professors said, it's time that we start reading the Bible, not just using the Bible. And if you actually read the Old Testament, then you will see that there are verses that will be matched one for all the verses I'm about to show you. I'm obviously not going to do that today, but read the Bible. Christians, we celebrate the apocalypse, right? We're looking forward to a big world war that kills everyone that's talked about in Revelation. We're anticipating violence. So none of this should come as a surprise to us. So what is the most famous verse that is used to say that Islam is a religion of war? This by far is the one that's cited the most. This is found in Surah 9, which is called repentance. That's the name of the chapter. If you read this verse, you won't get that, okay? But this is the most common verse used. Then, when the sacred months have passed, slay the idolaters wheresoever you find them, capture them, besiege them, and lie in wait for them at every place of ambush. Raise your hand if you have heard this verse. You will hear this on Fox News. You will hear this on CNN. You will read this in the newspaper. If you haven't already, I'm surprised. This is the most common verse used to say that Islam is violent. In order to interpret this correctly, though, we need to keep in context everything that I said with these 3 points. The idolaters, this is the Arabic word for it. This word has never been used in the Quran to refer to Jews and Christians. It refers to those Meccans who worshiped 360 different idols, who declared war on Muhammad and wanted to wipe him out. Meccans who had declared war first on Muhammad. That's what this verse is referring to. It is not used in the Quran, and the majority of Muslims do not interpret idolaters, or sometimes you'll see this translated as unbelievers. It does not mean all of us, because we are people of the book. We have the same revelation from the same God. Muslims will recognize that if you read this verse out of context, it sounds bad. They will recognize, and this is a quote from a Muslim professor in Nova Scotia, read in isolation, this sounds like an awfully aggressive, intolerant, if not criminal type of act. It suggests that people who do not accept Islam deserve to die. If you read that, you have to agree with him. Here's the problem. When this verse is cited, no one tells you that verse 5 continues. No one tells you that there is a part B to this part A. This is the part B. Can you switch slides, Dave? Thank you. This is the part B, and moving on to the very next verse. But if they repent and perform the prayer and give the alms, let them go on their way, for truly God is forgiving and merciful. And if any of the idolaters seek asylum with thee, grant him asylum until he hears the word of God, then convey him to his place of safety. Remember what I said before. The limit on lesser jihad says that peace must be attained, and if your enemy goes towards peace, you meet them there. The very second part of that verse that's always cited says, if they repent, let them go on their way. Let them go on in peace and in freedom. If an idolater, if any of these polytheistic Meccans comes and seeks asylum with you, if they're waving a white flag, you let them in. You can preach to them, and you should preach to them, to get them to convert from polytheism to monotheism, but you grant him asylum, and when it's time to go, you let him go in peace. In fact, convey him to his place of safety, escort him safely to where he goes. Nothing in these verses say you have to convert them. Nothing in these verses say that you have to lock them up. This verse just says, preach to him and then let him go in peace. If this doesn't convince you, let's look at what the rest of Surah 9 says. The next verses, we're going to go look above and we're going to look after. So the verses above says that you can kill, you can destroy, save for those idolaters with whom you have made a treaty, and who thereafter commit no breach against you, nor support anyone against you. So fulfill the treaty with them for its duration. Truly, God loves the reverent. If you have a treaty with them, you cannot kill them. Also keep in mind, who thereafter commit no breach against you. Again, violence has to be reciprocal, and violence has to be declared against you first. But if they stop, you stop. This is not wipe them off the face of the earth. This is not even, nothing in here says convert them to Islam. You're allowed to defend yourself. And most of us, if we're truly honest, would want a president, a commander-in-chief, to act the exact same way. If we are attacked, most of us do not want our president to follow the command of Jesus to turn the other cheek. Most of us want our commander-in-chief to retaliate, to protect us, to keep us safe. And if you pay attention to the presidential debates happening now, a lot of it is, how do we keep America safe? We want our president to do this. Don't kill the people we have a treaty with, but if they attack us, we attack them. If they go towards peace, we should go towards peace. This should not be a novel concept for us in 21st century America. Then the verses that come after that violent verse, verses 12 and 13. But if they revenge on their oaths after having made their treaty and vilify your religion, then fight the leaders of disbelief. Will you not fight a people who broke their oaths and intended to expel the messenger, who is Muhammad, and opened hostility against you first? This is in context of people breaking their oath, and remember that treaty of Hudaybiyah. Muslims, you have to turn around and go back to Medina. You can't perform your Hajj. You can't perform one of the most essential parts of your religious faith. Come back next year and we'll allow you. So Muhammad came back next year and they didn't allow him. They broke their treaty, broke their oath, and tried to kick the messenger out, tried to kick Muhammad out, and opened hostility first. That's the context. That's what we're talking about. So violence is permitted inside Islam if it fits these things. Making fun of the prophet does not qualify. There has to be an act of hostility, of armed hostility first, and there can be a defense of the religion itself. There are two conditions before the lesser jihad can be performed, before violence is permitted. None of this says that violence is permitted just for unbelief. None of this says Jews and Christians get to be killed because they're not Muslim. That's not the way these verses are used. Another verse that's often talked about is we've found in Surah 5. O you who believe, take not Jews and Christians as protectors. They are the protectors of one another. And whosoever takes them as protectors, surely he is one of them. Truly God guides not wrongdoing people. I have heard this verse used 100 times to say that Muslims are not allowed to take Jews and Christians as friends, because sometimes we see this word protector translated as friends or allies or neighbors. That's not the way the term is used in Arabic. The term used in Arabic connotes some sort of loyalty, some sort of mutual protection, some sort of political affinity. It means that Muslims are not supposed to take Jews and Christians as their primary form of authority, as their number one authority in life. Why? Because the way that we treat Islam in America today proves this. They are the protectors of one another. Jews and Christians protect each other, but they don't protect Islam. They don't protect Muslims. So the way that we treat, the Abrahamic faiths treat Islam today proves Surah 5. Don't take Jews and Christians as your primary authority because they are only concerned about themselves. They only try to protect themselves. We also see with the next verse the way that religion plays a role in political affiliation. Because if you take them as a protector, surely you are one of them. If any of us were to walk into a synagogue or a mosque today, we would not think of ourselves as Jewish or Muslim. But the way that religion operated in 7th century Arabia is that if you went to a different religious tribe for your protection, now you've become an expat. Now you have changed your political loyalty. Now you are treasonous. That's the way, and this verse proves it, that the way that we think about religion today cannot be the way that we think about religion in 7th century Arabia. They're operating completely differently. So we're thinking about the way that it violates the community, the tribe of loyalty that we have in a political context, and the way that religion is not just seen as an individual endeavor. This is also not used to say don't take Jews and Christians as friends, because previously in Surah 5, Muslims are told that they can marry Jews and Christians. That would be fairly contradictory in the exact same chapter. You can marry Jews and Christians, but you can't take them as friends? That makes no sense at all. So we know then that there has to be some sort of consistency across this. And so we're translating this as protector, not as forbidding any sort of friendly relations or friendship or treaties or allies with Jews or Christians. That's not the way that it's used. Are you with me so far? I know we're diving into text, but that's because those are the two verses I hear used the most. And when I talk to some of my friends and I ask them, when you hear about Islam being violent, what verses do you hear? Overwhelmingly, they told me these two, which is why I focus on them. But let's look at another one that talks about this context and the way that violence is permitted. This is from Surah 2. And fight in the way of God against those who fight against you, but do not transgress. Truly, God loves not the transgressors. Let me stop right there. Again, people who have fought against you, war has been declared on us first. Sometimes this transgress is translated as aggress. So no matter how we translate it, if we can't transgress during warfare, it means we can't sin during warfare. That means there are limits on violence. Sometimes, though, it's translated as we cannot be the aggressor, which means we cannot be the first to initiate violence because violence has to be done against us first. And slay them wheresoever you come upon them and expel them whence they expelled you. This is being done against you first, for strife is worse than slaying. But do not fight with them near the sacred mosque until they fight with you there. But if they fight you, then slay them. Such is the recompense of the disbelievers. But if they desist, then truly God is forgiving and merciful. If they desist, then there is no enmity save against the wrongdoers. The sacred month for the sacred month, retribution for forbidden things. So whoever transgresses against you, transgress against him in a like manner as he transgressed against you. And reverence God and know that God is with the reverent. Any violence that is allowed in Islam has to be reciprocal. Transgress against them as they have transgressed against you, which the beginning of my passage says they did it first. This is self-defense in a political context, and there are limits. The Quran does not say you get to go blow up innocent people in a cafe or on a bus or on the street. None of the verses that I have read allow that. Not a single one. Because we read what's all around these verses and the way that these verses are used. If we keep going, read the bottom part of that passage. And they will not cease to fight you until they make you renounce your religion, if they are able. Whosoever among you renounces his religion and dies a disbeliever, their deeds have come to naught in this world and the hereafter, and they are the inhabitants of the fire, abiding therein. Violence is allowed to protect your religion. If you're trying to say that Islam is not allowed, if you're trying to say that Muslims cannot practice their faith here, if you're saying that Muslims do not receive First Amendment rights and protections, now you're putting yourself in that last one. You're trying to make Muslims renounce their religion. And Muslims have a duty to protect themselves, to protect their practice of religion, just as we enjoy here in this country. That is allowed. But keep in mind what I said before, it's not just making fun of the religion that allows for violence. There has to be some sort of armed aggression. There has to be some sort of active hostility. All of these verses that we're using are being used, have to be used in context. The last one I'm going to show you that can look at violence is from Surah 8. And again, it's giving us these limited these limits on what violence is allowed. Say to the disbelievers, and again, we're translating as this, not Jews and Muslims, or it's Jews and Christians. Say to the disbelievers that if they desist, if they stop fighting, what is past will be forgiven them. But if they relapse, then the want of those old has already passed. And fight them until there is no strife, and religion is holy for God. But if they desist, then truly God sees whatsoever they do. And if they incline toward peace, incline thou toward it, and trust in God, for truly he is the hearing, the knowing. Reciprocal protection of your religion, but if your enemy goes towards peace, then you go towards peace also. Islam is not a pacifistic religion. It allows for the protection of faith, it allows for protection of family, it allows for the protection of homeland. If violence is done, it has to be done with the consensus of scholars and the consensus of the Muslim community in general. It has to be undertaken to correct a wrong that has been done against them first. It has to be reciprocal. It has to be used to protect Jews and Christians and Muslims. And if the enemy goes towards peace, then Muslims are commanded to meet them there, to also go towards peace. Yes, the Quran talks about violence. So does the Old Testament. These are not new. And in fact, the Old Testament says there are commands to go kill man, woman, child, animal. Wipe out entire cities and burn them to the ground. We don't see that in the Quran. We see when, but if they go towards peace, you meet them there. This is the way that we should be reading some of these verses in the Quran. These are the ways that we should be interpreting some of these verses in the Quran. But there are also verses that command peace. Again, I'm not going to do a one-for-one. But we're going to interpret the few, the ones that I'm bringing up here, in light of the many, because that's what Muslims do. So the next slide gives us, I understand that text is fairly small, gives us some of this peace engaged in this violence. The enemy wish that you disbelieve, even as they disbelieve, that you may be on a level with them. Again, disbelieve is in context of polytheistic Meccans. So take them not as protectors till they migrate in the way of God. But if they turn their backs, then seize them and slay them wherever you find them, and take no protector or helper from among them, save those who seek refuge with a people with whom you have made a covenant, and those who come to you with hearts reluctant to fight or to fight their own people. Let me say that again to put the right inflection in there. Fight them, save those who seek refuge with a people with whom you have a covenant. If the enemy goes towards someone with whom you have a treaty or a covenant, then they are safe. And those who come to you with hearts reluctant to fight or to fight their own people. Had God willed, he could have given them authority over you, and then surely they would have fought you. But part of this verse now, what I'm going to read next, is what plenty of Muslims use against Al-Qaeda and ISIS. It is not for a believer to slay a believer unless it be in error, unless it's a mistake. Whosoever has slain a believer in error, let him set free a believing slave and pay compensation to the victim's family, unless they remit it in charity. And if he, the believer that you have just killed wrongly, belonged to a people at war with you, but was a believer, then a believing slave is to be set free. And if he belonged to a people with whom you have a covenant, these are Jews and Christians because we are all people of the book. And so Muslims have a covenant with Jews and Christians. If you kill a Jew or a Christian, let him pay compensation to the victim's family and let him set free a believing slave. The exact same punishment as if you killed a fellow Muslim. Whosoever slays a believer willfully, his recompense is hell, abiding therein. God is wroth with him and curses him and prepares for him a mighty punishment. Muslims are not allowed to kill fellow Muslims, Jews, or Christians. The number one target for ISIS in the world is fellow Muslims. ISIS kills more Muslims across the world than they kill Jews and Christians. They are violating their own scripture, and the Quran says that they are going to hell for it because they have slayed believers. How do they get around this? Well, they aren't actually Muslim. They aren't actually Jew. They aren't actually Christian. That's not what the Quran says, though. That's not what the Quran says at all. If you slay a believer or someone you have a covenant with, i.e. Jews and Christians, then your punishment is hell. The next slide, please, Dave. This should be a litany of verses. Perhaps. Next slide, please. Thank you. Got to make sure I'm starting with the right one. Surah 4, verse 90. And if they withdraw from you, do not fight you, offer peace, for God does not allow a way against them. If they go towards peace, then God has, the way that this says, God allows you no way against them, that's a polite way for saying you are forbidden to do so. You are now no longer under the context of the lesser jihad. You are now no longer under a threat, which means warfare is not allowed. If they go towards peace, you go for it. Surah 41, verse 34. And who is more beautiful in speech than one who calls unto God, works righteousness, and says, truly I am among those who submit. The good deed and the evil deed are not equal. Repel by that which is better. Then behold, the one with whom and thee there is enmity shall be as if he were a loyal and protecting friend. Yet none shall receive it save for those who are patient. And none shall receive it save for those who possess great fortune. The greater deed outweighs the bad deed. If this sounds familiar, we have in Proverbs a love turns away a wrathful response, answer, act. Do good. That's what that verse commands. Do good. Repel by that which is better, which is the good deed. Surah 5, verse 48. For each among you, and this is in context, remember, this is the surah that I read last week about Jews and Christians all receiving the exact same revelation from God. So for each among you, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, we have appointed a law and a way. And had God willed, he would have made you one community, but he willed otherwise, that he might try you in that which he has given you. So vie with one another in good deeds. Jews and Christians and Muslims should fight to see who's doing the best work for God. Unto God shall be your return altogether. Jews and Christians returning to God altogether. And he will inform you of that wherein you differ. God gave Jews the Torah. God gave Christians the New Testament. God gave Muslims the Quran. If God wanted, he would have made us all one religion. This verse very clearly says it's not Muslims' job to go convert Jews and Christians to Islam because God gave them a particular scripture, God gave them a particular way, and at the end, when we return to God all together, God will let us know which one was right. It's not our job in this world to do it. But what does all this mean for ISIS? And what does all this mean for Al-Qaeda? Because that's what we hear about in the news, and they are the ones who are trying to hijack what Islam is. The next slide will give us that. First of all, ISIS is more extreme than Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda kicked ISIS out because they were so extreme. So now we're talking about two very different groups of people. We can't lump them all together. But if we want to talk about religious extremism, we're looking at the way that they use these verses out of context. Oftentimes, that's what literalism does. It ignores the verses that come before it. It ignores the verses that come after it. It ignores what these words mean when they were revealed by God. They were kept in that language for a particular reason. God mandates that the Quran is not translated. Oops, sorry. But if we want to understand it, then we have to look at it in its original context. ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they don't do that. They don't do that at all. Not only that, but remember, when we are interpreting the Quran and interpreting Islam, we're doing so with consensus of scholars, following the teachings of the prophets that are not found in the Quran, and doing so as a Muslim community. Which means that ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they ignore 1,000 years and more of Quranic interpretation. Because when they say suicide bombing, go for it, not only are they ignoring do not slay yourselves, but they're ignoring the way that that's been passed down for over 1,000 years. Completely ignored. So what do ISIS and Al-Qaeda want to do? I'm going to focus mainly on ISIS because they're the more extreme, because they're the ones who are trying to set up a country. They're trying to set up a caliphate. And if you read some of the founders of ISIS and some of the theologians from them, this is what they aim to do, and it is somewhat contradictory to the way we see them operate. If we are supposed to fight self-sufficiency, and if we're supposed to fight idolatry, then the only way to do that is to always submit to God, which means that ISIS wants to create a theocracy where God's rule is established. And the way that ISIS says this is that if we obey humans for our laws over God, then now we have created an idol. Now we are worshiping a human being. So our human being should never be our final authority for anything. God should be. This is very clearly a theocracy then, because we need to set up a society that follows God as the primary authority. Once we do that, then Islamic extremism says we can set up a place where Islam can be freely chosen. Again, they will say we can't force people to convert. Al-Qaeda says that more than ISIS. But they say we can't force people to convert, but we're going to create a theocracy where they can't help but convert. Where they can't help but freely choose. And so I put that in quotations very particularly because they do want to overthrow systems of government that rely on humans, not God. But they're not going to force convert. But again, ISIS does this differently than Al-Qaeda does. So once we have that, first of all, I will say that this idea of where Islam can be freely chosen, American Muslims see that as being protected in the First Amendment. As long as we're not banning Islam from this country, as long as we're not forbidding the creation of mosques, as long as we're not saying that Muslims can't worship freely, the First Amendment, according to American Muslims, means that they can freely submit to God. They can freely worship God, which means America does not need to be overtaken. America is a land where this is already happening. But again, as long as we don't take away those freedoms from them, that's a very key part to this. Once we start restricting their religious freedom, now we have a problem. ISIS also wants to say that this applies to the whole world. Most Muslims are interpreting the Quran in their particular context, in their particular area. So American Muslims look at the First Amendment and says, we're good. They look at Indonesia. Indonesian Muslims say, we have the freedom to practice. We're good. ISIS says we need to get rid of the entire world because the entire world relies on human authority rather than God's. We can see how this is an extension of fighting self-sufficiency and idolatry, but taken to the extreme, which is why they're called extremists. We're fighting the same battle in some sense, but they're taking it much, much further because they think that any human form of government deifies humanity. So then, if that's the case, then they'll say that any form of warfare doesn't have to be defensive because we've already set up idolatrous systems all across the world. We're already being attacked. So now we have to purge these systems of government. Notice the language I'm using, because this is the language that ISIS is using. We're going to purge forms of government. We're not purging Jews and Christians. Do they target Jews and Christians? Yes. Do they target fellow Muslims? Yes. Are they targeting Hindus and Buddhists and atheists? Yes. But all of it is to set up a religious form of government in the extreme where God is the primary authority, not a president, not a prime minister, God. And so for ISIS, this word religion that they use is not just a form of individual belief, it's a way of life that is infused in the government. They don't see a separation of church and state, because if we are supposed to create societies that make it easy to submit to God, then you cannot separate church and state, or in their case, mosque and state. You can't separate them because you have to submit to God in your form of society and government. That's what ISIS is trying to do. And so, as I said already, they get around verses that say, don't kill yourself, or they get around verses that say, don't kill Jews and Christians and Muslims, by redefining these words. So they'll say, well, they're not truly Muslim, or they'll say you're not truly Jewish or Christian, and so we can kill you. They get around the verse, do not kill yourself, by saying, if I'm truly supposed to fight self-sufficiency and idolatry, then the most selfless thing I can do is blow myself up for God. That proves that I don't rely on myself, that I only rely on God. Despite God not saying that in the Quran at all. Do not slay yourselves. I don't think it can be made any clearer than that. But that's the way that they take this to the extreme. So when ISIS is going through these museums and these countries and destroying museums and destroying statues, it's to fight idolatry. Most Muslims across the world will not go to a museum and say, I see a statue of the Buddha, and that risks my religion. ISIS does, taking it to the extreme. But everything that they do is done in terms of a political context. And if you look at polling from across the Muslim world, Pew did a massive survey a few years ago of 35 different Muslim countries. And the vast majority of Muslims across the world denounced any sort of terrorism or political violence. And the ones that did support it, they supported it for political reasons, to get troops out of where they consider to be their homeland. So then ISIS sees American troops in Saudi Arabia as a threat. They see American presence in Israel as a threat. But it's political context, not religious context. Those Muslims being polled and surveyed do not say, God tells me to blow people up and so I do it. It's a political endeavor for them. And ISIS is doing that very, very clearly. That's why they want to set up a state in Syria. The last thing I'm going to show you, so we can open up for questions, is this picture. This is the best picture I have found to describe this. There are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. And when we talk about the Taliban and we talk about Al-Qaeda and we talk about ISIS, we need to recognize that these are mere drops in a pond. If there are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, and if the Quran teaches violence, and if Islam is a warlike religion, then why aren't 1.6 billion Muslims waging war? Why aren't 1.6 billion Muslims blowing themselves up? Why are there Muslims all across the world condemning ISIS, preaching religious freedom, and saying, not in the name of my religion? I will bring this up more on next week when we talk about American Muslims. But there is a very big response to Islam to ISIS across the world by Muslim clerics and scholars. One of the biggest ones recently was signed by 110, if I remember correctly, 110 different leading Islamic theologians. And they wrote a 60-page paper to ISIS condemning ISIS using the Quran, saying what you're doing is not our religion. They wrote it in Arabic because ISIS is not going to read it if it's not in Arabic because we can't translate it. But they did put it out in English for the rest of the world to understand also. And from all across, we're talking Muslims from Spain to Saudi Arabia to Indonesia, 110 leading Muslim theologians condemning ISIS. It's happening. They are speaking out against ISIS and terrorism because they recognize everything that we just talked about today. That the Quran does not promote terrorism, does not promote killing people willy-nilly, does not promote killing men, women, children who are innocent, who have not committed any violence or armed hostility against Muslims. Remember, 113 of the 114 chapters in the Quran start with, in the name of God, the beneficent and the merciful. That's who God is in Islam. That's what the Quran is. That's what 1.6 billion Muslims believe. I'll open up to questions now. Why did what take so long?
To start fighting, saying that the Quran didn't support it.
Yes, why did it take so long for Muslims to say that the Quran doesn't support ISIS? It hasn't taken long. The next day after 9/11, Muslims all across the world were condemning it. In 2003, a Muslim cleric from Spain put out a 600-page legal opinion condemning terrorism. We have to recognize that we live in some sense of the world with a short memory. If we think back to the Cold War, the enemies were always Russians. If we think back to World War II, the enemies were always Japanese and Germans. Now we're fighting another enemy, and in 25 years or 50 years, it's going to be someone else. And in each of these time periods, people who are being condemned are speaking up and saying, that's not who I am. The sad thing is that the news doesn't report it. So that's why I'm going to bring it up on next week. I'm going to talk about the clerics who are condemning it, both in America and abroad. I'm going to be talking about the community service acts that American Muslims do all across the country. But it's not getting the news. It's not sensational enough. It doesn't make money. And that's a sad thing, because now the media is favoring broad sweeps of entire religion while ignoring that picture right there. Yeah. Next question. It's on. Is it on now? Yeah.
So I wonder, when you talk about the ISIS group trying to killing other Muslims, is there as part of the belief, is there a belief that Sunnis are not true Muslims, or that the Shia are not true Muslims?
Yes. And so we're going to talk about the Sunni-Shia split next week. It comes all down to religious authority. This split, and I think I brought this up last week, but the split between Sunni and Shia has to do with who's allowed to take over after Muhammad died. And if you follow the group that wasn't allowed to take over after Muhammad died, and again, that depends on which group you're in, but if you follow the wrong one, now you're no longer properly Muslim. So now we do get to kill you, right? It's the exact same thing. So this is the example that I used last week. It's the exact same idea that we saw in Ireland with Protestants and Catholics killing each other. You're not properly Christian because you're following the demonic and antichrist pope. So I get to kill you. It's that exact same sort of logic that makes no sense to the vast majority of the community. Yeah. In the back.
Will you define ISIL?
Or ISIS? What is the deal between the two?
Well, ISIL and ISIS are the same thing, and they're also called Daesh, Daesh, I believe. And they are an extremist group that is bent on political domination. So we're seeing them in Syria, especially, taking over after the nice little political chasm that we have there now. We see them spreading across the world a little bit. But they're trying to set up their own form of government that's a theocracy. They call it a caliphate. And so they're setting up it's a political endeavor. They're setting up cities, and they have their own tax system. They created their own currency. This is all a political endeavor inside Syria, and now trying to spread a little bit out. What else? I feel like I didn't answer your question, though.
Two different forms of terrorism, then? Would ISIL and ISIS be two different forms?
So, ISIS and ISIL are the exact same people. They're just called different things. Okay. So ISIS is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. That's what the acronym stands for. It's an English acronym. ISIL is probably an Arabic acronym. I don't remember, though. The president has been calling them ISIL instead of ISIS, so I'm sure that's coming from the State Department. And Daesh is a nickname, basically, for them that most Muslims prefer to call them because it has something to do with calling them illegitimate. But Daesh is an Arabic slang for them, in other words. They're all the same group, though. Yeah. So, question up here, and I'll repeat your question aloud.
The point you mentioned about all these killing, they have killed more Muslims than any other, is well taken. Because everywhere there, pillage and killing people has happened. In Indonesia, the most recent example, probably over 90% of the people are Muslim.
Yes.
It happens in Pakistan, 90% and over.
So,
And it's all over the world, same thing.
yeah. Yeah, so as he says, if you want to keep going, I'll let you, but let me repeat so I don't forget. He says the point that ISIS is killing majority Muslims is well taken because the majority of examples we see across the world are that way. So we're looking at Indonesia, and there's an instance a few months ago of ISIS terrorists marching into a mosque after Friday prayer to kill Muslims. Right before the Paris bombing, a couple days before, there was a massive bombing in Lebanon committed by ISIS that killed majority Muslims. So he's saying that ISIS is killing the majority Muslims. That's absolutely true. Where they're bombing is predominantly Muslim-controlled areas.
They themselves call themselves Muslims. They have named themselves ISIS, which I call it is. I hope it was.
Yes, absolutely. I hope that with you. Yeah. So I see a question in the back. We don't have a microphone there yet. We need it for the recording. Yeah.
My question is, the beheadings that we've witnessed in some way or another, is that in any part supposed to be representative of something in the Muslim culture?
Representative Muslim culture, no. What we do see it as a form of medieval death penalty, essentially, right? That beheading was a very common form of the death penalty in political contexts. And so, beheading is not found in the Quran. I'm sure there are examples that they're pulling from the Hadith or from the Sunnah because that's the way that executions were done in the Middle Ages. And ISIS and Al-Qaeda tend to be stuck in medieval interpretations of the Quran, not contemporary interpretations of the Quran. So it's not a Muslim thing, it's a medieval thing.
But in the Quran, there's no mention of beheading people.
Correct.
So where are they drawing that from?
So then they can draw it from the Hadith, which are the teachings of the Prophet, and they can be coming from a chain then. So we're now we have Hadith that have come after the Prophet. But in order for a Hadith, a saying of the Prophet, to be seen as legitimate, we have to see it in terms of evidence, like in a crime case. There has to be a chain of custody. There has to be a direct link back to the Prophet in order for it to be seen as legitimate. I don't know precisely where ISIS is drawing their justification for beheading. I'm sure it's someplace in there that had a medieval origination, but don't quote me on that because I'm not 100% certain. Other questions?
Yes, I heard a rumor one time that the word grace is not mentioned in the Quran. Can you verify that or not?
I can say that's not true. Grace is absolutely found in the Quran. I don't know if this has a good index for me to do it or not. But grace is found in the Quran. I know this is really bad TV for those who are watching the recording of it. So I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, at least 8 verses there that mention grace. It's all over. Grace, the gracious one, is one of God's names, 99 names in Islam. When there's talking about forgiveness of sins, it's saying that God gives us grace. So grace is found in the Quran. It's translated differently, or it's conceived of differently than we do in Christianity. These words are not one-for-one equivalents. But grace is absolutely found in the Quran, the word, yeah.
For the person who is very, very, let's just say, I don't know, I'm naive or whatever, but when it comes to ISIS versus Muslim, I have no problem with Muslim faith people, the Islamic faith. I fear for them as a Christian. When it comes to ISIS, when I think of them, I rarely even think of them as Muslims. I just think they're renegades. They're just mad. They're mad. They're seeking crazy, crazy things. So my question leads up to you saying that they're wanting to make political states in Syria having nothing to do with the Muslim faith?
It has creating up creating up the systems of governance inside Syria has to do with the Muslim faith, because they're gonna take the Quran and implement it. Whatever Muhammad set up in Medina, in that country where he was the ruler, the mayor, the governor, they want to set up that exact same constitution essentially, which means that they want to set up a 7th century constitution. So it does have something to do with Islam. We can't say, and again, I said this at the beginning, we can't say that Islam is pacifistic. We can't say that Islam does not have a problem with extremism. We also can't say that Islam is the only extreme religion or is the only religion with terrorism. The way that most Christians don't want to call the KKK Christian, most Muslims don't want to call ISIS Muslim. But that actually does a disservice to both religions, because we have to recognize where our own religions can be misinterpreted, and we have to fight against that misinterpretation. So we should have a vested interest in saying that ISIS and Al-Qaeda are Muslim, but we have to recognize that they're extremists, and 1.6 billion Muslims are fighting against them in what we call jihad of the pen.
If they fight against the very thing that is the very first thing you named.
They're fighting against, she asks, how can that be if they're fighting against the very first thing that I named? And it's because they interpret things differently. They will see then, they won't read this idolaters in this 7th century context. They will say, well, an unbeliever is someone who doesn't believe like I do. And therefore, we have now reinterpreted the word, which is what most extremists do. Yeah. There's a question in the back corner.
Thank you. You mentioned that the KKK shouldn't be referred to as Christian. I'm not sure if that's exactly the way you said it.
I want to say the exact opposite. The KKK should be referred to as Christian because they use Christianity as their defense.
Well, to be more accurate, the KKK is the enforcement arm of the Democrat Party.
Well, we're not going to go there. We're not going to go there.
You should go there because that's an accurate thing.
We're not going to go there. Are there other questions? Question over here.
Yeah. We've been talking primarily of ISIS. Do you feel that the other groups, Taliban and Al-Qaeda, will eventually consolidate and be one group? I know they all have different political aspirations, namely ISIS. And what really is the purpose of Taliban and Al-Qaeda? How do they really fit in?
Good question. I will say to your first question, I'm not a foreign policy expert, and so I don't know what the political endeavors of Taliban and Al-Qaeda are. Most of the times, these groups are fighting themselves, all because they see the chain of authority as different. The Taliban is, at least was let's say a smaller form of ISIS, limited to Afghanistan, taking over the government. Al-Qaeda doesn't try to set up a government. They're trying to be mobile, which is why the most influential Al-Qaeda group is now in the Arabian Peninsula, on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. And so I don't see them consolidating because they have different goals. Taliban and ISIS want to set up governments. Al-Qaeda doesn't. They want to kill idolaters, translated differently than the Quran lets them do it. If I say anything more, I don't want to make a mistake because I'm not a foreign policy expert. I don't do international relations or anything like that. Yeah.
Could you explain how the fatwa is issued?
Yeah,
that's actually the authority for that comes from.
That's actually a good question. We have this word fatwa that's used quite often. Remember that how the Quran is interpreted, one of the ways is the consensus of scholars. And because of the question over here, what ISIS tries to do, a lot of people, they recognize the Quran as some sort of legal code, just as we would recognize the Old Testament as a legal code. Remember, both Moses and Muhammad are trying to set up governments and societies. So there have to be laws that govern behavior. The question is, how do we interpret those laws, or how do we apply those laws? So the word fatwa is the Arabic term for a legal opinion. You have to be a credentialed authority to issue a fatwa that is binding on the entire Muslim community. So this then leads back to the question that was asked last week. how do we gain the consensus of scholars? How do you become a recognized theologian or jurist or lawyer? And it has to do with training. You basically go to law school, and you are trained in Quranic interpretation and Quranic legal codes. So once you graduate, then you pass the equivalent of a bar exam, and now you're credentialed. You probably then go work at one of the universities or continue your studies in the universities. As I said last week, Egypt is very famous for having some of the best law schools to interpret the Quran. But if we're using a fatwa, then it has to be probably signed by someone who's internationally recognized and someone who has that the rest of the Muslim community can get behind. There's not a direct equivalent example that I can use. That's what makes this really difficult. The example that I tried to use last week is saying that these legal scholars, we can liken them to all the Supreme Court justices, pretend that Supreme Court has term limits. So we're going to liken them to all the previous Supreme Court justices, the current Supreme Court justices. Let's add in the attorney generals, certain senators and Congress people who have spent their life studying this. And we're going to add some of the people who argue in front of the Supreme Court, some of the famous people like Doug Laycock. Let's add him in here because he knows what the Constitution says. So a fatwa has to be issued by someone like that. Famously, Osama bin Laden issued a fatwa against American troops in Saudi Arabia in the 1990s. The problem is that Osama bin Laden had no legal training. He was not recognized as a legal authority by the rest of the Muslim community. He was recognized as authority by his own followers, but that doesn't make someone a legal authority because that's, again, 50,000 people, not 1.6 billion people. So he didn't have a legal authority to issue a fatwa. That's also why the fatwa that I mentioned earlier that was put out last year against ISIS was signed by 110 or however many there were of people who were legally allowed to issue fatwas. Now this is really binding. Imagine every Supreme Court justice, every president, every attorney general, and all members of Congress signing the same piece of paper saying this is what the Constitution means. That's the legal authority that I want to put on that because that's the best equivalent that I can give you. Does that answer your question? There's no one for one. That's why it's hard to explain what a fatwa is and the way that the Quran is understood in a legal context. So I think that's the best I can do.
Yeah, the word fatwa reminds me, a few years back, you may recall the first Ayatollah issued a fatwa to assassinate Salman Rushdie.
Yes.
He thought that he was blasphemous towards Muhammad. But of course, they didn't get to come through. Salman Rushdie is still alive.
Correct. Yeah. So we see these trying to be issued by people for a lot of reasons. But recognize that they're contested. There's differences of interpretation. Since there's no one supreme leader in Islam, like we have the Pope in Catholicism, it means that we debate these things quite a bit, actually. We have one over here, and then I'll move over there.
I'm looking at the screen and the vast population in countries other than the Middle East.
Yes.
And I'm wondering whether there is anything that we see from that vast population in the rest of the world which addresses the agony and the terrorism at the present time. I'm thinking about the fact that there has risen out of Christianity like a Martin Luther King who just got us marching in the right direction as Christians.
And this will make me I'll let you continue, but this will make me very unpopular, who was killed by white Christians for what he said. Now we are holding him up to be a leader, but he was killed by people of the same religion for exactly what we're holding him up to say now. Let's keep that in mind when we reference Martin Luther King. But keep going.
I'm just wondering whether there are movements in the vast population of the rest of the world to
Absolutely.
make moral corrections.
Absolutely there are. We see one whole branch of Islam called the Ahmadiyya movement began here in America in the 1940s, 50s, if I remember correctly. The Ahmadiyya movement as a whole is very focused on this type of thing. We see Muslim scholars becoming very popular. So people like Reza Aslan, who's going to be speaking at Willamette next month, I believe. People like him are becoming popular and speaking on a large platform about trying to take back their religion in some sense, because they recognize that their religion has been hijacked. People across the world, we don't hear about them in America. So if I cited names to you, they probably wouldn't mean anything. But we see clerics in Spain and Portugal. We see clerics in Indonesia and in Turkey speaking out against these things. Is there one leader that everyone rallies around? No. There are multiple leaders across the world that are very influential for the regions in which they are. Malala is a great example. Yeah, Malala won the Nobel Peace Prize. The girl from Afghanistan. Who was shot by the Taliban for going to school. She could be one of these one single unifying figures because she's absolutely doing that. Yeah, Malala's a great example. So,
where does Sharia law fit into all this?
So again, we'll talk about Sharia law next week. But Sharia law is trying to interpret how to apply Islam to society and in a political context. But as I said last week, there's no book of Sharia law. There's not one thing that we look at. It's not a singular constitution. It's debated and contested and interpreted through fatwas. So I'll talk about that more next week because I want to talk about the relationship that American Muslims see with the global community. That's going to help us position how American Muslims see themselves. But Sharia law, it tells us how to conduct society. But again, it also gives us the worship. So the 5 pillars, the prayer, the fast, the Hajj, the statement of faith, and the charity, all of that is Sharia law also. So, but we'll address that a little bit more next week.
Do you have any numbers on how many atheists and agnostics exist kind of in the Middle East and Indonesia? I know in the Europe and the United States, agnosticism and atheism are some of the fastest growing faiths, or not lack of. It just seems like, I don't know, the developed worlds, that seems to be, I don't know, a little more catchy or something. But in these places, is atheism and agnosticism popular at all?
Fairly small. I can't give you a firm number, but fairly small, and that's because of the role the Enlightenment has played on the Western world. So the way that we see atheism and agnosticism playing a role in Europe and the United States and Canada and these places has to do with the Enlightenment, which impacted the Arab world very differently. So atheism and agnosticism is not popular in the Middle East. It's harder to say that for Southeast Asia because in places like Indonesia, Thailand, they conceive of religion slightly differently. And so we see atheism isn't its own category. So we see atheist Hindus, for example, and there's no contradiction inside Hinduism whatsoever about not believing in God and still being Hindu. So we can't put a firm number on that in the Southeast Asia area. But in the Middle East, very small numbers, but I can't give you a firm one. Yeah. No. Any last questions?
Matt, I think it's wonderful the way you've got your parents working for you.
It is. They're my runners. They're my runners.
I've got a question. If these fringe groups, if these extremists are supposed to be trying to enhance their connection with God, and they're doing God's work, how do they then explain their clerics and the radicals that actually lead them away from God? You know what I mean? Some of these people are. Yeah, some of these people are, they look at him as, we got to listen to this person because he's the radical whatever. How do they rationalize that when you're supposed to only be focused on God?
Because they see these leaders as leading them towards God. Oops, I cut out. It's really that simple, but it's also that complicated because this takes us stepping into the mind of someone else and stepping into an extremist mind. So first of all, we're trying to move our minds into another religion. Not only then are we trying to move our minds into another religion, we're trying to move our minds into the fringe group of the religion. That's difficult to do. So all I can really say is they don't see their leaders as drawing them away from God. They see 1.6 billion Muslims as not following God properly, as not being sincere or not surrendering themselves enough to God. That's how they see the 1.6 billion Muslims. But their leaders, we can't say they're prophets because there's no more modern day prophets inside Islam, but think about a lowercase p prophet. This person's leading us toward God in the way that Muhammad always intended, according to ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. I think that's the only answer I can really give you, because it's a whole new way of thinking for us.